So welcome everyone today. We are happy that you joined us for this great lecture with David Gushee, professor from Mercer University. So before we start, I would like to introduce Anatoly Denisenko, who will moderate our today's lecture. And he will introduce our today's speaker, Anatoly Denisenko. He is a fellow researcher of our institute, and he is also an expert on political theology. So I am happy to invite him to introduce our today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Ksenia, and welcome everybody to this seminar. I would like to introduce our speaker, Reverend Dr. Professor David Gushee. He is Distinguished University Professor of Christian Ethics at Mercer University, Chair of Christian Social Ethics at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, if I pronounce it correct, and Senior Research Fellow in International Baptist Theological Study Center. He's also the elected past president of the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Christian Ethics. Dr. Gushee is the author and co-author or even editor of nearly 30 books, different books, including Kingdom Ethics. This one, the big one, the Kingdom Ethics. Actually, this book was my key book in Christian ethics when Professor Gushee taught me Christian ethics at a Christian seminary at Osijek around 20 years ago. And also he's the author of After Evangelicalism, Righteous Gentiles, of the Holocaust, Introducing Christian Ethics, and the many other books and articles. He is widely regarded as one of the world leading Christian moral thinkers. He and his wife Jeanie live in Atlanta, Georgia. And Professor Gushee, he's introduced us to one very important topic, and the name of his lecture today is Defending Democracy from its Christian Enemies. I have some summarization of this lecture, but I don't want to read it because we are limited in time. I just want to mention that in my personal library, I have many books on this topic. I would like to share with you a few books because this topic is very interesting. For example, I have this book, Doing Theology in an Age of Donald Trump. The claim to Christianity, responding to the far right. And also the book Christian Against Christianity. It's also about how right-wing evangelicals are destroying our nation and our faith, American nation. And for example, book Western Fundamentalists. So there is a lot of books, and Professor Gushee will introduce us to this topic and present us his book, the last book that he wrote about this topic. So Professor Gushee, please, it's your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anatoly, Ksenia, and it's so good to see all of you. I know I met all of you online last year, I believe, in the Summer Institute. And I'm glad that we could arrange this time. It is an honor to be with you. And I once again want to express my love, respect, and support for Ukraine, and my honoring of your struggle for freedom and for democracy. My book is here. It's called Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, a rather provocative title, which I think I can explain in my lecture. It came out last week here in the US, and it is accessible now as an ebook or a print book, and it's going to be an audio book as well very soon. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen and find. There it is. Is that showing up? Okay. Let's see. Okay, I think I'm going to show my slides in this way. Hopefully that's quite visible to you. Somebody tell me if it's not. And I understand that this is there's simultaneous translation happening, and I'll just talk, and I don't have to delay, so I'll just keep talking. We have a lot of material here, so here we go. My book explores and defends the thesis that many Christians in the United States and elsewhere are today demonstrating an attraction to a dangerous authoritarian and reactionary politics that poses a grave threat to free and open democracy. This is how Christians in many countries, and I talk about 7 countries in the book, have in the past and still today sometimes constitute an opposition party, you might say, to democracy itself. I argue at a normative level that responsible Christians need to recommit to democracy, or commit for the first time, and to retrieve the historic resources that have contributed to a 500-year-old pro-democracy strand of Christian tradition. So my argument is precisely not that Christians, if we are to become Democrats, that means abandoning our tradition as Christians. Instead, my argument is that we have traditions in Christianity that have already contributed for centuries to a pro-democratic political vision. And so I try to describe some of those resources. My book is a warning about democratic backsliding and the appeal of authoritarianism, especially that which is aided and abetted by Christians who are attracted to anti-democratic politics, and in so doing are abandoning, I would say, our best social, ethical, and political traditions. So let me walk through the argument, and each one of these chapters has a quote that I'll give you at the beginning. Reinhold Niebuhr famously wrote in the 1940s, man's capacity, I'm updating his language, so our capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. These days we're having to, including in the United States, go back to first principles to even restate what democracy is. Quoting Yale University political scientist Bruce Russert, I say, democracy is a political system in which nearly everyone can vote, elections are freely contested, the chief executive is chosen by popular vote or by an elected parliament, and civil rights and civil liberties are substantially guaranteed. Democracy is characterized by universal franchise or vote for adult citizens, equal franchise power, which means everybody's vote counts the same, by majority rule, by competitive elections, and by the right to stand for public office on the part of citizens. Democracy is characterized by freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and other freedoms, by rights charters that aim to protect core liberties and the rights of minorities, and by the rule of law embodied in a written or unwritten constitution. This longer list of characteristics of democracy comes from political scientist David Koizis. In a democracy, the people and their elected representatives write a constitution and the laws that fit within the structure of that constitution. Political leaders and civil society leaders recognize that irresponsible and impulsive exercises of majority will or popular sovereignty must be constrained. So they support checks and balances on everybody's power. They are deeply committed to the rule of law, equally and fairly enforced upon all, and careful legislative deliberation in the writing of laws. And they also support an independent judiciary, which reviews laws and tests them against the Constitution. In a democracy, law is made by the people, but in a paradox of democracy, the perceived legitimacy of laws require that they reflect what the people widely recognize to be transcendent or grounding principles that go beyond merely popular will. So law is not arbitrary. Legislators are not free to pass just any law. Law must fit not only with a well-written constitution, but also with principles that the population widely agrees are just, fair, and so on. In a direct democracy, rule is directly by the people, like in the town hall or local congregation of a congregationally organized church. Direct democracy is generally unworkable in communities of any large size, which was recognized centuries ago and was one of the problems with Athenian democracy in ancient Greece. So eventually, representative democracy was developed, in which the people voted in representatives to do the work of governance in their name. And anybody who could be voted in could be voted out or impeached in office, meaning removed from office for misconduct. In a very significant document in American political history called the Federalist Papers, which was written in the late 18th century to describe the Constitution and to argue for its ratification in the US, representative democracy is described as Republican government. In the book, I talk about a silly line of argument that some people are offering in the US right now that says the US is not a democracy, we are a republic, which means something to people that doesn't actually make sense in terms of, I think, political tradition or ethics or history. So the US system is both democratic and Republican, and that is, it's representative democracy, but the people are the ones who elect those leaders. In the Western political tradition, political philosopher John Locke, writing well before the American Revolution, building on people like Thomas Hobbes, offered what has been called liberal or libertarian grounding for democracy. In his social contract theory, government is created by some individuals, especially property-owning individuals, in which, though they might prefer to remain free, separate, and independent, and without government, they compact together to protect their own security, freedom, privacy, and property. And thus, government flows from an agreement of the people to establish a political system that can benefit all, but at the cost of losing some of their individual liberty. Now, some Christian critics of democracy say that this just is what democracy is. In other words, that Lockean democracy or democratic theory is, you might say, democracy. And they have a problem with a number of features of it, including its libertarianism, its individualism, its elitism, its lack of a substantive shared vision of the common good. And these, I think, are some legitimate criticisms. It does help to remember that there were Christians arguing for something like democracy even before John Locke, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. A question that comes up in any democratic or a country that is attempting to do democracy is, if we emphasize personal freedom and toleration of difference, pluralism, and religious toleration, and so on, what kind of vision of the common good will hold us together? In other words, you need more than democratic procedures. You need at least most of us would now understand, you need some shared account of the common good. And that has historically been provided by tradition, by religion, by culture. And so what does this look like in contexts in which there is a lot of lack of agreement on all of those matters? We could talk about that if you want. In the book, I borrow the categories provided by Freedom House, which offers kind of international metrics for the democratic health of societies that claim to be democracies. And they break down their criteria into two categories: political rights and civil liberties. So here's a summary of their list. A healthy democracy has free and fair elections and the administration of elections, the freedom to form and reform political parties, realistic opportunity for opposition groups to gain power through elections, a situation in which various segments of the population have full political rights and opportunities without discrimination based on like religion or ethnicity, in which policies of the government are set by elected leaders only and are not, say, bought and paid for by corrupt economic forces, in which there are strong safeguards against political corruption, bribery, nepotism, and so on, and in which there is a government openness and transparency. On the civil liberties side, Freedom House says a healthy democracy has free and independent media, freedom of religion, and also freedom for non-belief, freedom in the academic and educational arena, freedom of political expression, freedom of assembly, freedom for non-governmental organizations, trade unions, and civil society groups, an independent judiciary, due process, equal treatment of all segments of the population, freedom of movement, freedom to own property and start businesses, equality of opportunity, and freedom from economic exploitation. So what Freedom House does, and you can look up their website, is they assess countries on these two metrics, political rights and civil liberties, and give them a score, as well as indicating the direction of movement within the past year, either healthier or less healthy. It's a tremendous resource, I think. So chapter 2, alternatives and threats to democracy. C.S. Lewis, the Christian writer, wrote during World War II, "I am a Democrat because I believe in the fall." Despite ancient Greek roots, modern constitutional democracy is a relative latecomer to human politics. If you look back on the history of government and politics, this broad generalization, I think, is true. After the agricultural revolution and the formation of the first cities in the ancient world, most sizable city-states centralized power in ruling elites or absolutist monarchies, many of which had vast imperial ambitions. Religion and politics were closely aligned or even fused. The attempt to separate religious and political institutions is a long-standing challenge that is viewed in the liberal tradition and the Baptist tradition, actually, that I represent, as essential for a modern democracy. There must be a separation between religious and political institutions. This is precisely what did not exist in the ancient world. Now, when one looks at ancient resources, there are some really rich and interesting materials in the Hebrew Bible. The covenantal tradition, the rule of a law that actually comes from God and is not owned by the family dynasty, subordination of all in the covenant community to the law of God. There are some rich resources here that are important for thinking Christianly or biblically about political organization. Modern democracy was a gradual development traceable to the late 16th and early 17th century, though you can actually see some seedlings of it, some expressions of it earlier. But the birth and then the widespread evolution of modern democracy reflected hard lessons that had been learned in the past. regarding the dangers of political absolutism, especially when linked to religion, as well as economic changes associated with the rise of early capitalism. Here's a point I promised to talk about. Dissenting and persecuted Christians in the early modern world played a key role. I'm thinking, for example, of the separatist Puritans or the Baptists, the Anabaptists, and so on. They played a key role in demanding limits on state power, religious liberty, rights charters, and democratic participation for citizens. The democratic revolutions of the 18th century, the 19th century, and even the developments in the 17th century were supported by at least some Christians who were motivated by their experience as religious minorities and their awareness of all the excesses and bloodshed and dangers of state, church, kinds of arrangements. Skipping ahead, so democracy spreads throughout the world in the 19th century and the 20th century. The book talks about the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 30s, communism on the hard left, the defeat of fascism in World War II, the survival of communism, but its discrediting for all of its manifest injustices and cruelties. And after the fall of communism in the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, it appeared that democracy was heading toward a global triumph. It looked like countries wanted to be democracies. But today there are many signs of what's called democratic backsliding and deconsolidation. These days in the US, both liberals and conservatives accuse each other of illiberal and authoritarian tendencies. And I take the accusations of both sides seriously, but I'm pretty much convinced that the problem, at least the one that seems most obvious to me, is right-wing authoritarian Christianity in many countries. The book talks about nationalism, fascism, populism, defines these terms, draws distinctions, but I generally use the term authoritarianism as the main concern. I say political authoritarianism is marked by the weakening or loss of popular sovereignty, the rejection or destruction of political pluralism, the entrenchment of a dominant individual or party, an end to genuinely free and fair elections, escalating attacks on political freedom and participation, and erosion of constitutionalism, the rule of law, civil liberties, and civil rights. I'm especially interested in those societies that are democratic and are eroding in their democracy. And that's why this term is defined the way that it is. Political scientists Ziblatt and Levitsky in 2018 describe authoritarian political behavior contributing to democratic backsliding in 4 key categories: rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of political violence, and a readiness to curtail the civil liberties of political opponents in the media. And they were saying, they're American, they were saying as far back as 2017 that Donald Trump already in his campaign was exhibiting all of these tendencies. And that only worsened. On reflection, we can see that democracy is not just about constitutions and laws, but about norms, practices, and culture. Democratic cultures must be built over time. And once they have been built, their health can be growing and thriving, or it can be weakening, or even collapsing, or anywhere in between. I've been following American politics for 45 years. And I concur with many others who would say that our democracy is at risk in a way that we have not seen in our lifetime. So, authoritarian, reactionary Christianity is the term I use for a group of Christians who I describe as trying to bend history backwards toward a pre-modern world of Christian political and cultural hegemony. I work first on the concept of authoritarianism, and I say that religious authoritarianism is an understanding and practice of truth and authority in religious institutions in which hierarchical and centralized power prevails throughout the religious system. And I think we have to acknowledge that Christianity, with its ancient, pre-democratic, pre-modern roots, carried forward many religiously authoritarian and pre- or anti-democratic political tendencies into the modern world. For Christians to embrace democracy required an abandonment, reinterpretation, or modification of much Christian tradition and history. We can now see that not all Christians actually made the move to a democratic way of thinking, either about their own religious communities or about the societies in which they live. And the older pre-democratic or non-democratic or authoritarian traditions are always available for retrieval. You can ground them in a certain reading of scripture, and there's plenty of traditions, the Christendom traditions, you might say, divine right of kings and absolute authority of a Christian ruler. That's always there in the tradition to draw from if you want to. I also talk about the politics of reaction. Hirschman, political philosophers, argued decades ago that dramatic political, cultural, and social changes tend to evoke equally dramatic negative reactions against them. You can pretty much count on it. Even if most people in a society think that changes are positive, there will always be some who are opposed. I would say that traditionalist Christian reactionary tendencies are visible from the very earliest stirrings of the modern world. Christian, individuals as well as authorities were among the most articulate opponents to everything that came beginning in the 18th century. Democracy, religious and moral pluralism, equal rights across religion and race and gender. In other words, there were always Christians who were yearning for the old regime. Also suggests that waves of negative reaction are visible in different cultures at different times, but the most relevant for today is fierce negative response to the social changes that have occurred throughout much of the world since the 1960s. Pretty much every cultural change, including the women's movement, gay rights movement, in our country, immigration of people from all over the world, civil rights movement for racial equality, sexual revolution, and many, many other changes have been reacted to negatively by traditionalist Christians. And this is, I would say, this is apparent in other countries as well. In chapter 4, I try another book and another paradigm to describe where we are, borrowing from Michael Walzer's book, The Paradox of Liberation. He comes up with a paradigm of secular revolution and religious counter-revolution. Walzer examines post-war, that is World War II, secular revolutions in Israel, India, and Algeria. He shows how anti-colonial revolutionary movements sought to create secular cultures and democratic politics in 3 new nations. But he says in these countries with 3 different religions, roughly 20 to 30 years after independence, the secular state was challenged by a militant religious movement. In my book, I focus on Israeli politics, obviously interesting in light of where we are at this exact moment. And so this language of religious counter-revolution is in the air in the U.S. I quote a man named Glenn Elmers, who did lead the Claremont Institute, in California. He said, "It's all hands on deck as we enter the counter-revolutionary moment." All kinds of people here are talking about taking America back from what they call the secular revolutionaries, the liberals, the woke, the gay rights movement, those who are against God, country, church, etc., as they see it. I think there's a very dangerous apocalyptic dynamic of counter-revolutionary despair. How could all of those evil people have gotten so much power and be taking our country away from us? Combined with periodic jubilation at apparent victories, such as when their candidates win, or when the Supreme Court, or some court, overturns abortion rights, as in the case of the Roe v. Wade decision overturned a year ago. So overall, what I see is a Christian counter-revolutionary reaction to the social revolutions of the 1960s, which can be described as secularizing in the sense that that the power of traditionalist Christian leaders and values and religiosity has declined dramatically in the last 60 years. I think that in retrospect, it's possible to see conservative Christians attempting to reverse unwanted cultural trends through 3 different strategies. Mission and evangelism, let's tell everybody about Jesus and take back our culture. Regular democratic politics, let's get Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush elected. Let's get the right kind of person in the presidency. But I would say that right now, a significant number of traditionalist or conservative Christians are unhappy with the results of these efforts. They see themselves as a persecuted minority. They see their values being rejected by the majority, or the state, federal or state, local, refusing to impose their values. The traditionalist folks, some of them, are deeply desiring to retrieve and, if possible, impose a conservative religious and moral vision from the center of political power, taking the nation back for God, perhaps by any means necessary. The boundaries provided by democratic culture and democratic norms and practices are weakening, as a certain sector of people in different countries believes that they're in the middle of a religious, cultural, and ideological war for ultimate stakes. And I would say they're more and more saying, and not quietly, that democracy is fine if our side wins, but if our side does not win, democracy may not be a matter of ultimate loyalty. We may have to consider other means. So if you're actually in a war, this is a quote from another person from the Claremont Institute, if you're actually in a war, even if it's a cold war, you behave differently. You're less inclined to compromise. In war, you don't negotiate until you've won. By the way, we're not in a shooting war in the US, but people are speaking this kind of language, and some of us are concerned that this kind of language is creating the conditions for a shooting war here, especially in a society that has 400 million guns. These days, authoritarian reactionary Christians, some of them at least, in the US are challenging church-state arrangements that are 235 years old. And this is becoming increasingly mainstreamed in the Republican Party. So in the next section of the book, I look at 7 countries and 2 more historical studies and 5 contemporary studies to talk about authoritarian reactionary Christianity as it expressed in those countries. I'll try to be brief here because I want to move, but one of them is Russia. And so I know you want to hear about that, but I'll just go through them and then we'll go to the resources to do better. Let me take a swallow here. So, chapter 5, reactionary politics in France from 1870. I actually go back to the revolution. to 1944. So you know that in 1789, the French Revolution swept the old Catholic monarchy aside. That was followed by a dizzying political instability, moving from an anti-clerical democratic revolution to mob terror, to autocracy, to monarchy, to empire, to democracy, to the Vichy regime, to the Fifth Republic democracy after 1958. In the book, I quote a number of anti-modern right-wing voices from the 19th and early 20th centuries that articulated xenophobia, anti-Semitism, ultranationalism, anti-communism and anti-socialism, royalism, authoritarianism, right-wing Catholicism, and proto-fascism. The story of France reveals the need for respected Christian voices in a society that can accommodate to modernity and democracy in the name of both the common good and Christian values. For Catholics, Vatican II helped. French Catholic thinkers helped to make Vatican II possible, but we're now seeing that a significant minority of authoritarian type Catholics are not really all that fond of Vatican II and its results. In chapter 6, I moved to what I call the politics of cultural despair in Germany from the mid-19th century to 1933. Figures Lagarde, Langban, and Müller-Vandenbroek offered what I call a reactionary utopian Germanic ideology that offered a despairing critique of urban, industrial, capitalist, materialistic, bourgeois, secular, rationalist, scientific, bureaucratic, pluralist, Jewish, quote unquote, democratic, modern Germany. They hated all of this. They dreamed of something both in the past that never really existed and projected a future that was essentially proto-fascist. And so these figures embraced what they called blood and soil, a mystical nationalism and imperialism, anti-Semitism, authoritarianism. Some of them offered a Germanized quasi-Christianity that was a precursor to Nazi ideology and racist culture religion. The German story in this period helps to show that Christian, that term, can devolve to mean ethno-tribalism in the name of Christianity. My chapter on Russia, I quote Patriarch Kirill, "What is happening today in the field of international relations is about human salvation," he said after the invasion of your country. The book talks about the collapse of the USSR and the brief abortive emergence of Russian democracy, then the consolidation of a personalist authoritarian state. That's how Freedom House describes Putin's Russia. We must acknowledge the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox nationalism and imperialism, in part because of Putin's purported defense of quote unquote Christian civilization and religion and values. The Ruski Mir ideology and Putin as the paradigm of an authoritarian Christian strongman. Putin, especially before the invasion, had a number of American Christians who believed his model of rule was attractive. One of them was Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham. His attraction has dropped a lot, but that history must be named. And the authoritarian Christian strongman who claims he is defending Christian civilization against liberalism, secularism, and all of that, that paradigm keeps showing up. I moved to talk about Poland. I know there's an election on Sunday in Poland, I believe it is, including the Law and Justice Party, once again up against other parties for that leadership of that country. A government, according to Astrid Prang, still succeeding in presenting itself as both the protector of the Catholic Church and the defender of the national identity. Freedom House now classifies Poland as a semi-consolidated democracy. That means it has experienced a lot of democratic backsliding. I described the deteriorating relationships between Poland and the EU. Obvious signs of democratic backsliding in all the areas of like election administration, abusive public broadcasting, a loss of media independence, attacks on the independent judiciary, return of public anti-Semitism, and the weakening of the civil service. There is the mainstreaming of cruel homophobia in the name of freedom and national identity, and an obvious conservative and Catholic political action partnership and strategy. We'll see whether that is what the voters of Poland vote for one more time on Sunday. As for Viktor Orban's Hungary, I believe it can be described as a dangerous model for how religion can be used to fuel democratic backsliding. Orban has described what he has built there in the last 13 years as an illiberal democracy. And there are many, many people attracted to, once again, the idea of a Christian strongman who gets into power, claiming to defend Christian values and Christian civilization through manipulating the rules of democracy in all the ways that I describe here, voting, public media, voter tourism, attack on the judiciary and independent universities, harassment of NGOs, etc. An ideological war on sexual minorities, George Soros as a proxy for Jews, some race baiting. Today, I would say in the US, Viktor Orban is the single most influential world leader for the authoritarian, reactionary Christian right. And I give a number of examples in the chapter of the way in which his influence has been elevated. Coming over to our hemisphere, I have a chapter on Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, a right-wing pan-Christian figure who unites conservative competitors in the religious marketplace. There is a definitely transnational religious right in our hemisphere that has a strong partnership between Bolsonaro and Trump when they were both in office, especially. It is easy to document Brazil's weakening democratic health under Bolsonaro before he was voted out. Same formula: attacks on the independent media and civil society and judiciary, corruption, nepotism, political violence, guns and threatening the use of them, anti-LGBTQ, anti-authoritarian, or authoritarian, I should say, rhetoric. Also, the formula of rumors and lies around the legitimacy of national elections and threats not to accept the election results. And there also was a post-election uprising when Bolsonaro was defeated. And there was a Catholic and evangelical authoritarian reactionary coalition that has strong echoes in the US. And then, of course, there's my own country. I quote a pastor who rallied a crowd on the eve of our January 6th insurrection, long quote, in which this pastor is basically saying, hey, go get them. If we don't have convictions worth dying for, we don't even know what living really is. Apocalyptic, rallying the troops. In that sermon, this pastor, who's infamous now, also praised the Proud Boys for their Christian support of Trump. The leaders of the Proud Boys are now all in jail. So we all know about what happened on January 6, 2021, when the certification of our election was interrupted by a mob with murder in their mind. We have seen a president contribute to democratic erosion in one of the most consolidated democracies in the world. I'm happy to report that in 2022, at the state level, a number of candidates were nominated by the Republicans who were clearly authoritarian and reactionary and Trumpist types, and they mainly lost, which gives me hope for 2024. However, it does appear that even if he is convicted of crimes, Donald Trump will likely be the Republican candidate for president in 2024. Whether he will win is unclear. We definitely see a right-wing radicalization and the American traditionalist church is part of that. A conservative writer named Matthew Continetti wrote a big book on the conservative movement in the U.S., which concluded the alienation from and antagonism toward American culture of the conservative movement right now could turn into a general opposition to the constitutional order. All right, so is there any good news? Well, yes, there is. We have traditions that are pro-democratic. I name three of them. One is what I call the Baptist democratic tradition. And here I profile my teacher, Glenn Stassen, with whom I wrote Kingdom Ethics. But also the people that he cites, I follow the trajectory and listen to them. Stassen wrote, the Baptists had insisted that the way Jesus made disciples was by teaching and persuasion, not coercion. Stassen argued that democracy should be supported by Christians, first of all, because of its contribution to civil and international peace. Secondly, it should be understood to be an innovation of Christian dissenters beginning in England under state religion oppression. Stassen argues that Baptist contributions to early modern democracy include rejection of authoritarian government, embrace of religious liberty, the disestablishment of a state religion, the free exercise of religion, and commitment to human rights protections. In the US, it's documented that our Constitution would not have been ratified by the state of Virginia, for example, unless religious disestablishment and religious liberty had been written into our what's called our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. Baptist clergy insisted on that in Virginia and told Thomas Jefferson, we will not support constitutional ratification without religious liberty and disestablishment. We have a proud history if you're a Baptist or a Baptist background, but it's also a Baptistic tradition, not just capital B Baptist, but congregationalism. And I talk about that in the book. The significance of congregationalism as training in democratic practices. When the people govern themselves under the lordship of Christ in congregations, they learn how to be Democrats. They learn what Stassen called an allergy to authoritarianism. And so part of building a democratic culture is protecting practices that are democratic in orientation in religious life. And if yours is a congregational democracy tradition, it should be protected. And then I talk about the Black Christian democratic tradition in the United States. Historian Randall Jelks has written, Black America flipped the script on a racialized democratic state. It is Black people's fight for freedom, for democracy, that makes the United States exceptional. So we know that racism as embodied in chattel slavery exclusively for people of African descent was a great evil that was a violation of the principles on which at least the United States was founded, that was written into the Constitution in some really awful ways, and that has been very, very difficult for us to dislodge, even after the Civil War, even after the end of slavery. So this chapter reflects on how white Christian supremacism and racism violates both the Christian and the Enlightenment values that undergird modern democracy. And that contradiction has desperately wounded our practice of democracy. And in fact, many scholars are demonstrating, including some of the people that Anatoly mentioned earlier, some of those books like Aubrey Hendrick's book, that authoritarian reactionary Christianity is quite often implicitly or even explicitly racist. The dream is of a white Christian nation, democratic or not. It's almost what you might describe as a pre-Civil War antebellum Southern dream of white Christian men dominating society again and everybody else being suppressed. This is sometimes called white Christian nationalism. But the Black democratic tradition for hundreds of years has challenged all of that. It has struggled it has told the truth about the fatal damage of white supremacism to democracy. And that would be true of any racial bias that undercuts equality and liberty for all. But the Black democratic tradition has fought for real democracy with full equality, civil rights, and political participation for all people on equal terms. A major headquarters for that democratic social gospel protest tradition has been the Black church. And there is no consistent white church equivalent, though there have been progressive leaning white churches. But you might say the headquarters for the Black resistance democratic tradition has been the Black churches in the US. And then lastly, and I'll move towards closing, my third main resource is the language of covenant. You first see covenant surfacing first. Well, obviously, it's a biblical concept. It surfaces among the Puritans in the 16th and early 17th century. And when the Puritans came across the ocean and came to the US, they used covenant language to describe government. In the Massachusetts Constitution, it says the body politic is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen and each citizen with the whole people. Now, the problem with the original Puritan vision in the US, at least, was that everybody was not included. Indigenous people were not included. African slaves were not included. And sometimes even people of non-Puritan religious traditions were not included. But the concept that that a political community should be seen as covenantal, that it means we have mutual obligations that are sacred before God and with each other, that we're not just individual rights bearers or rights maximizers. We ought to think of ourselves as covenantally bound to everybody in the community and committed to the well-being of the community, not just to what I want or what we want, is very helpful. So if we modernize covenant and actually borrow the Black democratic tradition, which said what we need, Martin Luther King said this, others said it, what we need is a new, inclusive, democratic covenant in which all are included on equal terms. Only this kind of covenant could repair the disastrous weaknesses of the original U.S. democratic covenant. So I call in the book to renew an understanding of covenant obligations in a democracy, and especially call on those who are entrusted with government roles to articulate clearly their understanding of their covenant obligations and constraints. If you're a governor, if you're a prime minister, if you're a police officer, you have covenantal obligations specific to the role. Are you willing to be governed by those constraints and by the obligations that go with your covenant responsibilities? Overall, I call on Christians to renew serious democratic covenantalism and to reject authoritarian, reactionary Christianity. I say that if we remember that Jesus Christ is Lord, we will not be tempted to what some people are saying, hey, this is an emergency. All of that nice stuff about Jesus being Lord gets suspended right now. We need to recall rich biblical resources that have also undergirded Christian democratic thinking. God as creator of all, the image of God, God as covenant maker, the idea of the law applying equally to all with special attention to the most vulnerable, the prophetic tradition that teaches social justice under covenant and law, the vision of the perfected creation in the reign of God. But meanwhile, amid imperfection, while we wait for the perfection of the creation, we do justice, we love our neighbors, and we wait. I argue that we need to reconnect with constructive traditions that already exist, and I've already described what those are. And then we need to recommit to a healthier Christian identity in which inclusive social changes do not drive us into an angry identitarian politics. I pose a vision of a healthier practice of democracy and the rule of law, with Christians renewing their commitment to the common good, to bearing a non-coercive public witness, to advocating for everyone's civil rights, to resisting authoritarianism, and participating in democratic citizenship along with others. And that is where I will stop. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Gushee, for your presentation, for the lecture. We have 30 more minutes, maybe 40 more minutes for questions and your answers. And I would like to ask you my first question. In your lecture, you mentioned some countries like Poland, like US, like Hungary, and so on. But now we have a war on the Middle East, and many people, they are saying that Israel is an example of democracy and in the Middle East territory. So what do you think if you compare with the United States, with your democracy? What do you think about Israel democracy?
I would just say, and I say in the book, that Israel's democracy has been damaged by some of the same authoritarian and religious reactionary tendencies that we're seeing in the U.S. And especially the current government under Netanyahu has included, I understand they're about to redo their government, but it has included some not very constructive voices. I would also say that inability or unwillingness, the inability to end up with a negotiated settlement to the Palestinian problem has meant essentially the occupation of a people who have been who don't have citizenship and are not really a part of any functioning state, and that's not good for any democracy. So the protests that were the main story out of Israel related to the judiciary reform, I think involved millions of Israelis saying, no, we see this as the path to authoritarianism. We want to protect our democracy. So I would say some of the same stresses and some of the same reasons for those stresses are visible in Israel as are visible in some of these authoritarian reactionary Christian contexts.
Thank you so much. We have at least 3 questions from our participants, and I don't know, should I read them, or maybe participant? What do you think? What do you like? Would you like to hear a participant voice and to see him, or should I just read the question in English?
Since we only have so much time, maybe you should just read the questions.
Okay, I will do. So the first question is from Vladimir Volkovsky. He's the researcher. He's a secular professor at the Secular University, and his question is the next one: how to protect democracy in democratic countries? Is it possible to distinguish between liberalism, democracy, and universal suffrage? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that the early dissenting Christian democratic voices, like in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, were pre-liberal. Stassen calls them arguing for covenantal democracy. If we identify liberalism with the tradition initiated by, for example, John Locke, then you have a different strand responding to Glenn Stassen would say that both the dissenting religious voices and the later like liberal and libertarian voices were responding to the same problem: state authoritarianism, religious intolerance, people being killed for having the wrong beliefs, marriage of church and state. But that the Baptist and Anabaptist and other dissenters had a different way of making the argument than people like Locke did. Most scholars would say that American democracy, at least, is formed by the combination of the religious dissenting tradition and the liberal Lockean tradition. It's both. Reinhold Niebuhr said that, for example. And so that both help to make democracy possible. So, for example, in a country like Ukraine that is building a democracy, I would say that secular, if it is secular, liberal, Lockean, or whatever kind of arguments for democracy are needed alongside of Christians saying we want democracy too, and we want democracy for our own reasons. And universal suffrage is part of democracy, should be either under the religious or the liberal understandings of democracy. Yeah.
Okay. And another question from Mikhailo Kozakov. He from a Reformed tradition.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on Christian Reconstructionism?
Yeah, Christian Reconstructionism is an effort to impose. The dream is of a society in which biblical law is the law of the land. This is a vision that goes back centuries as well. It's a little different from just kind of state, church, or monarchical, where the king is the head of has supremacy over both religion and the state, all of that. It's more like the effort to impose biblical law, including, for example, I've heard voices here, and I talk about this in the book, arguing for the execution of homosexuals on the basis of a reading of Leviticus. So I think Christian Reconstructionism is an example of authoritarian reactionary Christianity, and I oppose it.
Okay. One more question from Taras Kakovsky, and it is in Ukrainian language, and I will read in English. What, in the opinion of the professor, are the challenges for democracy posed by the growing Islamization of Western society? It seems that today it is Islamization that is already dominated, in the sense acting more actively than Christianity.
I am not an expert on the internal conversation within the Muslim community as to their own approach to democracy. I have spoken with enough folks to understand that how Muslims in the West, for example, or in Europe, or in the US, approach democracy varies. I think it is pretty obvious that you would have an authoritarian, non-democratic Muslim posture on the part of some, but you also, I know some very committed Muslim Democrats, little d, right? Religious traditions are always evolving. Leadership plays a key role in determining which direction they will evolve. So it becomes an urgent challenge in every land and in every religious tradition to lead people in the most constructive direction with their religious tradition. So yes, it is certainly possible that that a critical mass of not democratically inclined people of Muslim background could pose a problem for democracies in Europe. But right now, the much larger and older traditionalist Christian populations, at least in the countries that I described, notice that they're mainly Eastern Europe and the US, Eastern and Central Europe. It's a little different in Western Europe. So each country would have its own challenges. But yeah, in the world that I'm engaging, it's that reactionary traditionalist Christian community that I'm concerned about, and that's what this book is about. Yeah.
Okay. And we have a comment, not a question, a comment from Marietta Wandertol. Marietta, would you like to raise your comment, or should I just read it?
I'm happy to put it together with the question I put later, but I accidentally hit enter in the meantime. So David, first of all, thank you so much for your lecture. I've really enjoyed listening to what you had to say. I think there's a lot of questions I would like to ask, but I will limit myself to this one. So we know that ideas about the ways in which constitutional systems can be changed towards authoritarianism are being exchanged. So it was raised, for example, that there are conversations about potential changes in Israel. We've seen those before in Hungary, in the US, and in Turkey as well. I think Kim Lane Shepard writes about this. But I think my question, because you are specializing more in the Christian response to this, like, how much of this exchange do you see happen between churches or between NGOs that operate transnationally, whether through mission or through just transnational, like the structure of the organization? And I think, for example, of the role of particular lobby groups and institutes in Poland and Hungary, for example. I would really like to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marietta. I am seeing lots of international exchange of ideas and strategies. There are specific figures. We have an especially a person I especially dislike in American politics is a guy named Steve Bannon, who was an advisor to Trump. He has been spotted in Hungary and in Brazil, and in conversations attempting to retrieve some of the ideas even from the 19th century, kind of a quasi-intellectual. Now, he's not as big a deal as he was because Trump's not in power, but I know that in the US, there are specific NGOs that share legislative ideas. And because of our federalist system, we have the federal government, but we also have the states, 50 states. And authoritarian Christian legislation, there are groups that write laws, like model laws, that can then be proposed in different state legislatures. And that's happening, like rather, in some cases, very, very strict anti-abortion and anti-LGBTQ laws. So the Orban example is especially troubling to me because Orban has been lifted up, like on Fox News when Tucker Carlson was there. He had a week with Orban in Budapest, hanging out with him. Orban came to the US and spoke at the Conservative Political Action Conference. And people are paying attention to the ways in which he is ingeniously weakening civil society and checks, you might say, any checks on his power, and are looking for ways that such strategies might be attempted if, for example, Trump were to become president again. So yes, these ideas are being exchanged, and there are, I mean, anything can go viral on social media, but there's also NGO conversations as well. I'm not an expert on all the specific groups, but these same ideas are surfacing. These conversations are global, which also means that the defense of democracy also needs to be global, because the strategies that need to be combated are similar in many places.
Ksenia?
Yeah, thank you. We have one more question about the Ukrainian context from Nat Mirenkov. He is our constant participant of our summer schools. And the question is about some Christian activists in Ukraine. So while those activists, while defending conservative values, sometimes act in ways that many people find shocking or unwise, thus turning other Christians and especially secular society against them. At the same time, these activists pose themselves as sincere defenders of democracy. So the question is, can democracy be harmed by those who consider themselves its defenders? And what should true Christian Democrats look like?
I hear that's a great question. I'd love to know more, but I mean, we've seen similar here. Part of what we're seeing in the US is people who are so angry and so negative and reactionary, and who believe that everything is at stake, the whole future of the country or the future of the church in America. And so they have suspended or abandoned traditional, like, Christian expectations of behavior, language, integrity. It's like, this is an emergency. You don't play fair. you get out the knife, you do what you have to do. Character assassination, dirty politics, corruption, and so on, because the ends justify the means. Everything is at stake, so we can do what we have to do. And you'll hear people say, sure, Jesus talked about loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, etc., or whatever. That's not relevant now. We're in a fight to the finish against our enemies. An interesting thing is, this is so obviously unchristian that it turns off a lot of people. And we find, especially among the younger population, many of them raised in the church, that they are absolutely repulsed by what these people are doing, and it turns them into secular people. It turns them away from the church. And then that makes the reactionary folks even more upset, because they can see that they're losing their own children. So a general statement I would say is, bad religion produces secularism. Bad expressions of Christianity drive people away from Christianity. And people may believe that they're defending democracy, or whatever they think they're doing, but when Christians don't act anything like Christ-like, they drive people away from Christ and from the church. It hurts their own cause.
Maybe it is the last question from Nazari. It is the question about Orthodox Church. If you're familiar with the situation in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government want to lock or cancel a Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So what do you think from the perspective of democracy? Is it violation of democracy in Ukraine, or is it normal if we deal in this way with the Russian Orthodox Church on the Ukrainian territory?
I know I've only read like one or two things about that. So I don't really know if in a war situation, sometimes civil liberties are constrained if an entity is functioning as an enemy within the country. If that is what is happening, then I can see why there would need to be restrictions or limits. In general, though, the standard in a democracy is allowing religious liberty for various expressions of religion, up until the point at which a religious community is clearly violating the Constitution or the laws of the land, with as much latitude as possible before you have to make that very difficult judgment. One of the things we're seeing is national churches in general are a bad idea. National churches, whatever the tradition, or churches that essentially function as national churches, the way that the Catholic Church did in France, or the various Orthodox churches, to the extent that they get too embedded in a national identity. The inability to disentangle religion from nation and religious identity from national identity in general is not good for democracy. It's also not good for the moral integrity of churches. So this is going to be something for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to think about as well on the other side of all of this. So it's that disentanglement that I think is important in the sustaining of a democratic culture and in keeping a proper, healthy distance between church and state.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think we are done with the questions. So, Ksenia.
Yeah, I would like to thank you for this lecture and for your book. Very much for your time, and just thank you everyone who joined us today for your question and for being with us. It's like we are glad to see all those faces with us today. I hope that we'll have time in the future to see each other in person, not just via Zoom, but at least we have this opportunity, and that's also good, very good. That's a great chance. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you also for your book. Encouraged to read everyone this book.
Much for the invitation. It's been a real delight, and you know that as I said, my heart is with you, and I want to continue to be in conversation with individuals or in a group like this.